Okay, very good. Very flattered to be welcomed here to the conference. It's extremely well organized. The speakers are obviously exceptional, and the topics. I think the takeaways here are going to be something that'll stay with you for quite some time. So I'd like to preference my presentation a little bit by reinforcing that we will be having a panel discussion at the end. Some questions that you may have had coming up during Kevin's presentation. Keep those in mind. And as I present, as the questions, if I inspire anything that comes up for discussion, by all means, put them in the chat as well. And we'll want to have a lively panel discussion. That's one of my motivations to keep on track with my presentation, is to allow enough time for the experts here to discuss some forward-looking concepts of what we can be doing with analytics and becoming analytically driven. The other motivation is that I know that Dr. Whitfield has been really targeting statisticians in his jokes, and they're an easy target, and that's why I would also like to pile on. So as you look around the room, if you see anybody with their arms crossed, they just may be statisticians, and I didn't make a few friends there, right? So this is, as far as the conference being organized well, for my talk with somewhat of a focus on industrialization. It's such a natural piece. It's like another concentric circle outside of what you just heard from Kevin on operationalization. And the only reason I can say that smoothly is it's a core part of what we do here at TMA regularly. So I am actually the substitute presenter. This is the presentation from one of my senior consultants, and you can see the subtitle here is What's New, What's Not, Why Care? And I'm the one that added the why industrialize, because that's going to be my take on democratization, right? So the reason why we build out on democratization with industrialization is I want us to think a little more broadly about analytics than just the data. We're going to be looking at infrastructures and platforms and people and culture. And when we do all of this, you'll hear me using the term competency a lot. And that means that we're putting everything in place. Competency isn't just the skills of the different people that have to be at the table. It's about everything, all the wherewithal that you need to have in place for analytics to truly be operationalized and succeed. So with that, I'm going to be de-emphasizing the what's new and the what's not. I'm still going to touch on them because they were in the proceedings and they're promised. And it's also a good way to demystify analytics a little bit. I'm going to focus more in on the why care and focus a lot on the industrialize. I'm going to try to keep it to a half an hour so that I think we have a full hour here, so that we have about an hour for our panel to have some fun with all of this. So let's start with what's old. Well, you might not believe this, but it's actually the technology. So one of the more popular methods that we use in machine learning today still, arguably, or hardly even arguably, is neural networks. And when I was a young buck, straight out of college, I joined a neural computing software company. And this is where I fell in love with machine learning. This is a vision of the topography for a backpropagation neural network. Don't worry, we're not going to get technical here, especially at the end of a conference. But on the left side are the inputs. And this is where your data comes in. And you can see these arrows with W1, W2, W3. Those are actually weights. Those are what adjust. They're like multipliers. As the neural network trains, these multipliers change, and it's like a mathematical representation of how the brain works. This is what gets really cool about it. And so as the neural network trains, it takes a guess. That's where you see the output. It takes a guess as to what the answer should be, and this is just like we learn. And then it's obviously going to get an error, and we're going to take that error and back propagate it. This is like a back propagation neural network. And then it's going to iterate through this cycle. Well, when I was first watching this at the neural computing software company, when I took my first training, the error would go along and it wasn't really moving. I was thinking, boy, this is going to take a long time to train. And then the error started to come down, and then it started to gain momentum, and the error rate started to drop precipitously. And so did my jaw. My jaw dropped as well. I thought, my gosh, this was like an aha moment for the neural network. It was so cool to see how it learns. And to see this technology start to be applied in industry was really exciting. And these were the early days. Now, this was 1990. But take into consideration, this isn't when the theory came around for neural networks. This is when they started to be applied in industry because we started to have the desktop machines that could handle the computational complexities and intensities. So this is when the innovators were starting to see, hey, how can we put these to work in our organizations? But the theory for neural networks goes back several more decades to as early as the 50s and even the 40s. This is how old they are, and yet they are still the go-to methodology for AI and machine learning today. So fast forward, what's new? Well, if it's not the technology, maybe it's the technology. So staying on the neural network thread here, and there's many other technologies as well. I think you saw Mauricio gave a tip of the hat to decision trees. Well, this is an expansion on neural networks. And back when I was working on neural networks, our team would laugh at some clients that would add more of these hidden layer nodes in the middle because we didn't notice that there was any additional accuracy. It was almost like bravado to put more of these hidden layer nodes in. And the thing that we didn't have were the right kinds of applications. We also didn't have the computing power to really keep up with it. But there's also pre and post processing that has to be in place. And when you have all of these things, uh, the amount of accuracy that can be had on uh, uh, really complicated and complex, sophisticated types of applications, deep learning does an amazing job. Um, hit the forward button here. So among the applications is certainly image recognition. You've got the self-driving vehicles, very computationally intensive, has to take so many inputs into consideration. And image recognition just in its own is very difficult. These images have to be digitized, they have to be pre-processed, but, oh, and also there has to be a human in the loop to give the cases to allow the deep learning to be able to discern all of these images. But when it does, being able to recognize a dog from a child, from a chair to a car to a motorcycle, all these different objects becomes further difficult because just take the dog, for example. Some dogs are tan, some dogs are black and white, some dogs are in a bright lighted environment, some are in the dark, some are looking straight at you, and some are in a profile. And yet, with enough cases, deep learning can learn whether that's a dog, whether it's a cat, whether it's a skunk. You know, there can be a black and white dog next to a black and white skunk, but it will know with enough good cases. So, with all of this, how does this relate to your business, right? Well, unless you're in radiology or you're in advanced manufacturing with images of manufacturing flaws, and is this one going to become a problem down the line? Or in radiology, is this a potential tumor? And we have to make sure that we handle the false negatives properly to offer it up to the radiologist. Unless you're in one of those fields, this is one of those shiny new objects, right? Deep learning does live up to the hype, but it has to be in the right kinds of applications. So it's probably not going to relate to most organizations' applications around artificial intelligence and machine learning. So what's the lesson here? It's to be careful of the shiny objects. There are so many organizations that get tempted by these newest things. Hey, deep learning's doing incredible things over here, so let's go do that deep learning thing, right? No, don't be tempted unless there is a strong fit to the application. What we want to show you how to do first is to be brilliant with the basics. So that allows us to move ahead to why care. So we're going to look at a couple of models here around investments and returns. And return doesn't have to be return on investment, right? I mean, organizations also look at benefits and outcomes, but they do have to be measurable in some way. And this is an illustration from Bill Schmarzo. He's kind of a celebrity in our field. And what it shows here is pretty obvious that we make the heaviest investments in the baseline BI and IT exercises as we move up through the BI maturity pathway here. You can see that the investments start to go down when we go into some of the self-service analytics and the visualization dashboardings. And what's ironic is as we move up to advanced analytics and machine learning, you can see the smallest amount of investment, yet it's where the greatest return is. Some could argue that some BI and IT exercises, just having to get the data together, organized and stored is more of a cost center exercise, but it is absolutely necessary. It's the foundation of what's going to drive more things downstream. And that's part of the reason for this presentation. Many of you may be thinking, my gosh, machine learning and industrialization and operationalization, we won't be there for a while. But the thing is, if you're not thinking about the end goal, if we're not bringing the future into the present, we don't want you to be retrofitting and we don't want you to be preparing this huge refinery for diesel fuel, but the objective was to deliver it to the airport and they need jet fuel, right? So we want you to be thinking downstream as to how are we going to be using this? And even with the industrialization, I'm going to be making an argument as to why we shouldn't be thinking on a project by project basis. But I thought this was a great illustration as to where we are currently. And I see the investment side here becoming more monolithic. The investments that we have to make in BI and IT will never go away. Talk about great job security. There's always going to be new data to collect, and there's always going to be silos to break down. There's, always new ways to organize it. Now we hear about the fabric. I mean, there's always, we were moving to the cloud and hybrid systems. So there's always going to be that effort to take. But I do see investments increasing for advanced analytics and machine learning. So that'll become more monolithic on the investment side. It'll be more equal. It's going to equalize out across. And the returns, I think, are going to become more exaggerated at the top. That's, I think, what we'll be seeing. So got ahead of myself on my notes over here. So let's see where we are. So this leads us to, how did I get my pages out of order? Pardon me. So what this does, it leads us to an illustration that we had from a webinar back in 2008. And what's it tell you? Most organizations actually are very capable at the technology. They're building valid, sophisticated rockets. But the title of the webinar was Predictive Analytics Failure to Launch. Now, a lot of organizations since 2008, they're actually launching these rockets successfully. And in many cases, they're getting them into orbit. So they've got great data scientists, they've got a healthy technology stack, they've got the training to build these rockets, and they're more than adequate to the purpose. So why are these organizations still failing to find value with analytics? It's right here. It's the mission control. Most organizations don't conceive of the teams that need to come together, the communications that have to happen within the teams, and the collaboration that has to occur across different teams that have to collaborate in a very intentional way in order to achieve a mission. And you've heard this from numerous speakers, from yesterday to today, from Dr. Buzzkirk to Kevin. We've got to, and Mauricio, we've got to have that objective to pursue. Otherwise, we're just analyzing straight past value or benefit, and we're engaging in what I like to call cosmetic innovation, right? We buy that deep learning and we look important and we're coding the Python. But at the end of the day, if we don't understand how these decisions are going to be operationalized, what's your intervention strategy? What are we going to change? What are the micro decisions we're going to make with analytics? And how are they going to be measured? How are they going to be communicated to leadership? And how are we going to move the needle for the organization? If we're not looking at those kinds of things, at the end of the day, it's just analytics for the sake of analytics, and that's what we want to get beyond. So the big lesson here is that there's a huge strategic, social, and cultural aspect to this in the mission control that's being overlooked, and a lot of people see that as being this fluffy, feel-good, pie in the sky, kumbaya kind of approach to analytics, and it's not where the rubber meets the road. Couldn't be further from the truth. But don't just take my word for it. I'd like to go over a few quotes here from industry experts and from some major publications. This is from Robert Gentleman. A big computer, a complex algorithm, and a long time does not equal science. And I extend that a little bit myself in science, does not equal organizational impact, right? So this comes back to that cosmetic innovation. Let's make sure we're doing goal-driven analytics. Next, McKinsey writes the top 10 reasons that analytics projects fail, and the top 5 are really, well, 4 of the 5 at least, really have an emphasis on culture and attitudes and mindset. So look at the first one. The executive team doesn't have a clear vision or adequate command. They don't have to understand the sigmoid transfer function in the middle of the neural network, but they do have to understand what are the kinds of questions we can ask of this? How can we trust what the analyst is telling us? How can I set challenging goals that are realistic? And how do we look at opportunities that are, really going to align with organizational priorities? So they have to have literacy within their own lane, as each other lane has to have when they come to the table in that mission control. Nobody knows the quantitative impact that analytics is providing. You would be surprised at how many projects just start with the data and hope for some interesting insights that, again, are never operationalized. There's no strategy or framework that exists to operationalize analytics. I'm going to be talking to that in just a little bit. Analytic platforms aren't built to purpose. That's what I was alluding to earlier. Let's not, build our refinery for diesel fuel and it's to fuel the airport. And we don't want to retrofit later, so we do want to look downstream. Analytic roles, present and future, are poorly defined. I see leadership requirements for job openings that are asking these VPs to know how to code in Python. I mean, there's all sorts of examples where, and many don't understand how to qualify and interview data scientists, let alone define what one is. So those are a number of things that we have to take into consideration when pulling up to advanced analytics. Around mindset, this is from Gartner. The biggest threat to analytic innovation is organizational culture that does not accept failure. It doesn't accept ideas from the outside, and it cannot change. And these attitudes, again, they need to start at the top because that emanates down through the organization about analytics. If we really want to start breaking down these barriers in organizational resistance, there's conversations we need to have. We can dissolve so much of that if we anticipate what the resistance is going to be. I'll give you a quick example. Even with the users, if we're not going to mechanically operationalize the decisioning, we have potentially users who are going to take the decisions or the recommendations from this. And if they think that the AI model is coming in to take their job, if they just understand that we're going to automate some of the more mundane, repetitive decisioning that they've been making, it can free them up to be more creative and more valuable to the organization. If we just have that conversation in advance, imagine how the threat is removed, it's neutralized, it's something that would have come up. We would have had this black night. We don't know why they're, trying to resist. And there's a huge social component, and we see so many times that it's really not the technology that's holding this back. It is the human factor. We heard that a little bit earlier from Angela, right? And here's my own quote. I get to learn vicariously through a team of advanced analytic leaders. And they go out in the field and they come back and tell me about, where they encounter the greatest either friction or just can't get traction. So I put this together after learning vicariously from this team. Most organizations possess a technology fascination that obscures an outcomes-focused approach to analytics. There's this void of dysfunction between executives and data scientists that inhibits the industrialization of analytics. These nearly universal shortcomings present a strategic opportunity for growth mindset organizations. So keep that in mind. So now, why do we want to industrialize? Well, if you think of it going back to the Henry Ford days of assembly lines, right? It's not quite that simple, but it is very similar. So as you read down through these bullets of the advantages that we can have, let me have you think about that. It's about building this broader competency of people and technology and platforms and skills and attitudes and culture to drive an outcomes obsessed operation with scalable and sustainable benefit. And this should be your mindset from the outstart. And I'm going to make some arguments as to why we should not be starting kind of in secrecy, building these pilot projects just to prove out a concept. There's plenty of cases that show that when advanced analytics and machine learning is done right, there is tremendous benefit and gains. So don't waste your time trying to prove that out. You could be spending your time on building, like I say, a very valid model that just doesn't align with the expectations of the organization or many of the other constraints that we can look at in advance if we just look downstream a little bit. So in that case, I like to use a lot of metaphors. And organizations actually are better at kind of building homes. Now, the only thing I don't like about this illustration is on the right there, you see a master plan that's already built. And I wish I had one that just shows a house off on its own, because that's how many organizations are approaching advanced analytics. They're trying to build these one-off disparate models. And they're very hard to build, because imagine if you had the infrastructure of the master plan. You've already got the utilities piped in. You've got a lot of the framework and the platforms in place. And instead of building a single house, can you imagine you'd have to, have your own generator and septic system and all these other things that could be in place. And if we think about how to build this master plan in advance, then we have a record of all of the resources. And that's not just data, and it's not just platforms, the people and the other entities that need to come together to nourish and interpret and put into operation the decisioning that can come out of advanced analytics. So I want people to be thinking on that plane. And here's the tip to the framework that I had talked about. We have followed for many years an industry standard framework called the cross-industry standard process for data mining. It is fantastic. And we simply built upon it. We give it full attribution with the model that we use. And it has, well, we adapted it to 7 stages. And each stage has a number of tasks and subtasks. But the most important thing is, before we get into stage 1, we have a stage 0. And this stage 0 is looking at that master plan before we even get into the first project. And take a look at these major objectives here. Describe the current analytic practice. Let's not invest in technology that we already have in house. And let's look at the team members that we already have around. Gauge the analytics attitude. Organize the analytics team. Create the enterprise data plan, and that's many of the people that we have here already work on. And then create an analytics portfolio. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And then the initial report of practice readiness. And that's what Dr. Buzzkirk talked about yesterday. Is let's document everything so we don't have to rediscover it. So the framework is actually fairly comprehensive. We want to, oh, I'm seeing some comments here. 20 minutes left in the session. My gosh, we want to get to the discussion. I'm sorry about that. So, all right, we talk about the portfolio, and it's almost like to have the producer talking into my ear here. So we, the point from here then is we building a portfolio, how projects go into it. I'm going to have to fly through these slides. Then we qualify for a portfolio. And I'm sorry, I thought I had about a half an hour here, but we're asking to go on to the discussion. And so this was about ideation to get projects into the portfolio. We want to choose the ones that are most important to the organization. And then we come down to building the team. And the one thing I'll say before we move into the discussion here is that, underscoring putting the team together for the larger operation is that it does require that whole mission control here. So you can see all of the lanes for the process I was going to talk about, the framework. We have a lot of different lanes that have to collaborate in a very intentional way. So we've got the executive team and the data science team, and we've got project and program managers. We've got to handle the change management. We've got, of course, the BI and IT team. How are these resources coming in? We need to plan and document so that we don't have to repeat things later. And of course, we have deployment. One of my consultants says there will be no deployment if we don't consider deployment in advance. We want to make sure that we get these operationalized and that we ultimately understand how they're going to be measured and actionable. So, if there's anything, the big takeaways here, because Marcus taught me that we always want to summarize all of this. So think about the factory before building the first product or assembly line. Understand the type of fuel and its capacity and delivery before you start building your refinery. Consider your master plan before building your first house. And if there's a summary here, and matter of fact, let me, while I summarize, since we're crushed for time here, let me do a little tip of the hat. Looks like I don't have time to really go through the quips for Dr. Whitfield, but I'll get one in here. You can read this while I go through. If you think it's easy for a data scientist to get a job, you might want to think, or a predictive modeler, you might want to think otherwise. So the summary is, there's no greater purpose for democratization then to look downstream to advanced analytics and consider, plan, and bring everything to bear toward building a broader outcomes obsessed machine learning and predictive analytics competency. It's this competency that'll drive the greatest returns from your data and drive measurable, sustainable, and scalable benefit to catch the attention of your executives and even to the board level. And I very much apologize. I really thought we had a full hour here. I could take 30 minutes and we'd have 30 minutes for discussion. I must have misunderstood the time available. So I skipped over some of the framework that I was going to show and how we come up with the ideas for project concepts and boil them down to the ones that are lowest risk and highest impact. So I kind of skipped over that